Thank you, all of you, for coming and for honoring us with this invitation and with your presence. It was the honor of our lives, Ed's and mine, to work with Ronald Reagan, and it has been a very moving few days for us now as we meet his friends in Eastern Europe, in the countries he cared about so much, in Poland, now in Hungary, very soon in Czechoslovakia, where we will be meeting with those who tried so hard and fought so hard for freedom and now work so hard to help make democracy happen in a fully functioning and fully satisfying way. As Anna said, I am Peggy Noonan. I was a special assistant to President Reagan when he was in the White House, and I am now a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. And I am always honored to be in the presence of my esteemed colleague, Ed Meese. He is a great man. Of all of those veterans of the Reagan era, he knew the most. He was the closest with Ronald Reagan. He was there at the beginning. He was, as we say in America, present at the creation of the political career of this consequential man, Ronald Reagan. Very briefly on Ed, you all know that he holds the Ronald Reagan Chair at the Heritage Foundation, which, as you all know, is an extremely significant and important think tank in the United States, in Washington. Ed spent much of his adult life working for Ronald Reagan. First, after Mr. Reagan, who had been a former actor and a former sports announcer, after he was elected governor of California in 1966, 45 years ago, Ed Meese became Ronald Reagan's chief of staff. He also became the legal affairs secretary, I think, of President Reagan. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, Ed, from January of 1981, from Inauguration Day of 1981 to February of 1985, Ed held the position of counselor to the president. That is the senior job on the White House staff. You don't get any higher than that unless you are the president. And he functioned as President Reagan's chief policy advisor. He then went on to serve as the 75th Attorney General of the United States from February of 1985 to August of 1988. And as America's chief law enforcement officer, he directed the Justice Department, and through Justice, the FBI, and led international efforts to combat terrorism, drug trafficking, organized crime. But the thing I always think of when I see Ed was he was president. He was present at the creation of this extraordinary political career of Ronald Reagan. And Ed, something I've never asked you, but I've always wanted to ask you, how exactly did you meet Ronald Reagan? What exactly did you think of him when you met him? And how soon did you look at him and think, I see a president within?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think of it as sort of a historical accident that I met Ronald Reagan. I had worked in the state legislature, the state parliament, if you will, in the early 1960s, representing the district attorneys, the prosecutors, and the chiefs of police in California. It was my assignment as a member of a prosecutor's staff to do that. And so some people remembered that when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1966, and I later learned that one of the senators had recommended me to him, because one day, out of the blue, I get this call in December of 1966, would I come up to Sacramento, the state capital, and meet the new governor-elect? So I arrived up there without, I had never met him before, I had not participated in his campaign or anything else, and so after some preliminaries, it was arranged for me to meet him personally, and he walked in. He was just, it's a cliche perhaps to say that he was larger than life, but here was this gentleman who walked in, very friendly, obviously, greeted all the people who happened to be working in this particular section of the office, asked me to come in, and we talked for a half an hour. And in the course of that half an hour, I learned how much he knew about a topic that I was quite familiar with, the whole business of criminal justice. And at the end of the half hour, and also he was very friendly, at the end of the half hour, he offered me this job as legal affairs secretary. And I had no idea that I would be changing my work, but I accepted on the spot. I was so impressed with him. And as a result, I went to work for him when he took office then, at the 1st of January. And I was, as I say, my initial impression was that here was a real leader and a person I wanted to work for. As to when I realized he was presidential material, I think it was not so much, I recognized his leadership right from the start. He was just a great person to work for. I guess one of the examples I can give you was about 2 weeks after I started with him, he was supposed to meet with a group of police chiefs from around California, from the largest cities. And so I prepared for him a one-page memorandum with a number of talking points. And so we left his office to go down the hall to meet with these police chiefs, and I saw that he had left this paper behind. And I was much concerned that either he had rejected my work entirely or that he had just forgotten it. He went down there and gave a 20-minute talk to these police chiefs, and he had integrated all the points I had made into the remarks he wanted to make, and gave this outstanding talk just right off the top of his head. And as I say, hit all of the points that he had only been able to read once. It was at that point I knew that we had an extraordinary leader with us. But it was really many other people in the United States, newspaper reporters, other people, in the course of his first year as governor, started talking about him as a presidential candidate potentially, largely because California was one of the largest states in the Union, but also because of that he was making real changes there in the state, taking over from a state that was in bad financial condition, being able to convince a legislature which was made up in both houses of leading by the opposite party. And so I would say it was within the first year that I knew we had a person who undoubtedly could do more things, although he himself, when 1968, which was 2 years later, the first presidential election, although he was nominated, he himself felt that he was not ready, that was not what he wanted to do. He wanted to stay in California. But there was no question that in the minds of many people in the United States, he was had potential for being a presidential candidate.
So we know he was a tall, handsome, charming man. He was charismatic. He was well-spoken. He had a good memory. He had a certain way with people that made them feel appreciated. We know these things, and you saw these things. He had natural star quality, which in America 30 years ago, as in Hungary today, is something that matters in the political life. That having been said, what was going on in his head with regard to political philosophy? Where did he get his political philosophy? What was that philosophy? Why did you share it, which I think is the original reason you two clicked? You didn't click because you were young, attractive, ambitious men. You thought the same way, and it was an unusual way, and it had to do with this word called conservatism, which at the time, 45 years ago, was an unusual word in the American political landscape.
Well, Ronald Reagan was not awfully political in his early days, in one sense, but he was always a leader. And so he got involved in politics as early as being in high school. He was president of his class in high school. He was president of the student body when he went to college. Now, that's not political in the usual sense that we think about it in terms of partisan politics or political philosophy, but he was a leader. And then, of course, in the next phase of his career, when he was a radio broadcaster, a sports announcer, and a movie star, politics wasn't an awful big thing to him. He went and was in the Army during World War II. He was worked in the Army Air Corps, making training films, and being really kind of an announcer, a narrator of training films for the Air Force. It was really after World War II in Hollywood that he really got involved in politics and in conservative politics, because the communists in the United States tried to take over the movie industry. They wanted to infiltrate the various trade unions. Ronald Reagan's union was the Screen Actors Guild, the union of all the actors. There were unions of the photographers. There were unions of the people that ran the stage managing, the people called grips, and other people that worked in the movie industry. And they tried to take over these. There were 4 or 5 unions. They tried to take over these unions. And Ronald Reagan led the movie industry, his own union and the others, in combating the communists and ultimately keeping them from taking over those unions. And so that was really his introduction into in the political philosophy, and he studied communism from that point on.
We should note, one interesting thing about Ronald Reagan is that he was a liberal Democrat up until the 1950s. The first president, no, the last, he campaigned in 1944 for Franklin D. Roosevelt, the great liberal Democrat. In 1952, he campaigned for Harry Truman, a Democrat.
No, that was in 1948 for Truman.
Was it 40? Sorry, 52 was Eisenhower when he was starting to make.
And then in 52, he campaigned a change and campaigned for a Republican for the first time, which was General Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower.
Now, Reagan had always been, as everyone in Hollywood was, a vociferously anti-Nazi. And he often made speeches in the late 1930s, early 1940s against the Nazi movement, very pro the West, very pro, of course, America's efforts in World War II. But there came a time in the 1950s, as Ed mentions, when Ronald Reagan was a union head, union chief, the first American president ever to have had a union, the Screen Actors Guild. And what Ed is referring to is so interesting, because Reagan, who had been naturally anti-fascistic, saw communism coming into Hollywood, and he felt the same resistance to communism that he had felt to the Nazis. And yet when Reagan resisted communism in Hollywood, he got some pushback, he got some criticism, and all of a sudden he started to think a little bit about what the heck that means. Sorry to cut you off.
No, that's absolutely right. And he did a lot of reading. He read The Law by Bastiat. He read Hayek, Friedrich Hayek's work on the road to serfdom, and he was always a great reader from being a kid. He moved a lot when he was a child. His father couldn't keep a job, quite frankly, and so they moved from town to town. And one of the things that he always took refuge in was reading. He once said to me that if you have a book, you also have a friend. And so a lot of his friends were people that he read about in books. And so he read a lot about communism. He had a friend, the lawyer for the Screen Actors Guild, happened to be very interested in international communism. He wrote a book called The Treaty Trap, and gave that book to Ronald Reagan and several other books that he had written. And so he not only read a lot about communism from the standpoint of the domestic communism in the United States, but the philosophy of communism and socialism, and also the international aspects of communism. And so this really prepared him. Also, he was a great fan of Israel. He spoke, as many actors did, at the rallies that were raising funds for Israel in 1948 and so on. And so he had a broad knowledge of communism, which he then continued to read about and expand his knowledge. So he had that in mind when he was running for governor and when he ran for governor. And as a result of that, he broadened his perspective in terms of talking about the dangers of communism. This would have been then in the latter part of the 1960s, when a lot of the things that we know took place in that time, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe, were happening. And so that's why he had a very strong feeling about freedom and liberty, and was very concerned about what was happening in the United States. And as governor, he was very concerned about what was called Detente at the time, which was this idea of the United States living side by side with the Soviet Union, and in effect accommodating what the Soviets were doing as far as the rest of the world was concerned.
Now, Ed, let me ask you something. What was wrong, according to Ronald Reagan, as he rose in politics, as he became governor of California, and as a Republican governor of California, a very great and powerful state, our most populous state, that made him by necessity a major leader of the Republican Party in the United States. As he rose as governor of California, as he thought more and more about the Soviet Union, as in the 1970s he came to oppose détente with the Soviets, what was he opposing? What was wrong with having a certain coexistence with the Soviet Union? What was it that Reagan was thinking that the Democratic Party in the United States, according to his view, was not understanding about the Soviet Union?
Well, I think what he was worried about was the loss of liberty and the lack of freedom under the Soviet regime. And that was true both within the Russia itself, but also the other countries that were part of the Soviet bloc, the members of the Warsaw Pact. And it was this idea of, he had read a lot in his reading, not only about communism, but he read a lot about the United States history, the founding of the United States, and the importance of freedom was extremely big in his concerns about the direction of the world. And so I think it was this idea of freedom that was one of the motivating factors. The other thing was, he recognized that not only was there a lack of freedom under the Soviet Union, but also this détente was not really working, because the agreements with the United States and their protestations to the world about what they were doing were false, and that they were cheating on the agreements that they had with the United States. For example, in 1972, they had the anti-ballistic missile treaty that neither side would engage in developing anti-ballistic missile systems. But he learned, as it ultimately turned out to be a fact, that the Soviets were cheating on that. And they started almost immediately after the treaty to build an anti-ballistic missile system with gigantic radars and the other parts of the system. Also, he saw what they were doing around the world, the way they were in our own hemisphere, in Nicaragua. They had taken over, the Marxist government had taken over Nicaragua, and they were subverting El Salvador. You had Cuban mercenaries in Angola. He saw what was happening. He saw what happened in Hungary in 1956, what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968. He saw what was happening in Poland, even as he was taking the presidency in 1981. And so it was these concerns: number one, the lack of freedom; number two, the aggressiveness and the activities of the Soviet Union as they sought to conquer the world.
When Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, which was an amazing political story, he beat an incumbent president of the United States, Jimmy Carter. He also did it as a fairly unusual figure, a gentleman who wanted to change a great deal. He wasn't a politician who came forward and said, "Trust me, I'll change this a little, this a little, this a little." He said, "Trust me, I'll change a lot of things, a lot." One of the things I feel he did with regard to America's attitude towards the Soviet Union, and to me, one of the most central things he did with the Soviet Union, was decide philosophically that he would do something completely new for an American president. He was going to speak the candid truth about how he saw the Soviet Union's actions, philosophies, ways of operating. So he did a number of things. He called it an empire. This was unusual for an American president. He said it was a rather wicked empire. He said it imprisoned people. He said it was aggressive in its impulses. He scored it. I remember being struck by this as atheistic, as a suppressor of religious feeling in the countries that it controlled, especially what were called at the time the Warsaw Pact countries, Eastern Europe. It seemed to me always, and I think it seemed to Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher said of Reagan when he died, she said, he marshaled the English language and sent it out to fight for us. So the first thing she said about Reagan was he decided with words that burst through and that were particularly candid, he decided to define reality through words, define it clearly. And once you define reality clearly, then you can take steps to change reality and make progress. Now, as I make this little speech, I must admit to you, I am a former speechwriter. Of course, I think it all came down to words. You, I think, Ed, had a broader picture of what Ronald Reagan did to help change the U.S. relationship with the Soviet Union, but also, in fact, to change the Soviet Union itself forever. Besides candor and honesty, what did he set himself to do?
Well, I think you're right that words were important. They were important to Ronald Reagan, and because his life really had been a life of words, if you will. He'd been a sportscaster. He'd been a actor in Hollywood. He'd been a political figure, and so words were extremely important. He was able, in California as governor, to not only have a vision for California where they ought to go, but also to explain that vision to the people of California and get them to support it. The same thing when he became president of the United States. He had an ability to communicate a vision of where the people should be going, which they then would support, as they did in the 2 terms that he was elected as president of the United States. So words were very important to him, but also the words wouldn't have been worthwhile if he didn't have a vision of what he was trying to explain to people, and that was what he had, I think, as president. He had a vision both of the United States, how we could recover from the economic problems we had at the time, but also he had a vision for the world, and that was really, could be encompassed in 2 words, peace and freedom. And those were the 2 things he was interested in, and one of the things, in order to achieve both of those objectives for the world, was to deal with the Soviet Union. You had an aggressor that was stirring up trouble around the globe and was threatening peace, and so the way in which to, and also was had the Warsaw Pact nations, the captive nations, under their control, and were trying to gain more countries under Soviet control, and so to achieve peace and freedom, it was necessary to deal with the Soviet Union, and so he had a vision. He was asked by one of the people in the campaign when he was running for president in 1978, they said, Governor Reagan, how do you intend to handle the Soviet Union? And he said, somewhat facetiously, he said, well, Dick, to Dick Allen, it's really simple. My idea is we win, they lose. Now, he was not trying to be supercilious about this, but what he really had in mind was he felt that the Soviet Union could not long exist keeping people under oppression and having captives, and they could not exist and continue to expand in a socialist form of government, that ultimately they had the seeds of their own destruction within their system. And that's why he often told stories that he said came to him from people inside the Soviet Union, where the Russian people themselves were suffering, as well as the people in other countries. One of his stories
Tell us some of those stories.
Well, he used humor a great deal along with the words, as you mentioned. One of the stories he liked to tell was about the commissar who went out to the collective farm in Russia to inspect, and he says to the manager of the farm, "Comrade manager, how are the crops this year?" And the manager says, "Oh, Comrade Commissar, the crops there are magnificent. Take the potatoes. If you piled one potato on top of another, they would reach to the foot of God." And the commissar says, Comrade, this is the Soviet Union. There is no God." And the manager says, "That's all right. There are no potatoes either." Or the other one, which is my favorite, was he used to tell about, and according to him, these were stories the Soviet people told among themselves. Some of you folks may have had the same kinds of stories that were told in this country, kind of ridiculing the Soviet rulers. But the one about the man who had saved up his money for 15 years to buy a car. Not many citizens in Russia were able to get a car, but he had saved up his money, and so on the appointed day he goes to this bureau, this place where you get the permits to pick up your car. So he stands in line for 3 hours, which was commonplace then. He always stood in line. And finally he gets up to the desk, and the clerk there says, "What do you want?" And he says, "I'm here to pick up the permit to get my car." So the guy goes through this sort of shoebox there and pulls out a piece of paper and hands it to him. He says, "Your car will be ready 10 years from tomorrow." And the fellow says, "Will that be morning or afternoon?" And the clerk says, "Well, what do you care?" He says, "That's 10 years away." He says, "Well, I've got the plumber coming in the morning." So those were the kind of stories that he told.
Can I tell you that when Reagan had his first meeting with Premier Gorbachev in Geneva, he started telling Gorbachev his Russian stories and his Russian jokes. And at first Gorbachev was gracious about it, and he'd laugh and he'd admit, yes, we tell stories like that. In their second meeting, I think in Washington, Reagan told him more Russian stories. This time Gorbachev was feeling a little defensive. By the last time they met, Gorbachev said to him words to this effect, "Please, Ronnie, no more of the stories that we tell about each other." They were starting to drive him a little crazy. And Reagan laughed, and he'd still slip a few stories in, because Reagan felt that these humorous, teasing jokes that Russians told about Russia were a way of breaking through to Gorbachev on a new level.
You're right. I think, but to get back to what was going on in his mind, Ronald Reagan was dedicated from the time that he became president to using every resource of the United States, economic, diplomatic, political, military, every possible resource, to end the Soviet Union. He felt that there was no other way in order to bring peace and freedom to the world.
Now, that's what I meant when I said words are important, but he did other things. He put the Pershing SS-20s in Europe. He made diplomatic forays. He made daring gambits. First of all, in a great letter to Brezhnev after Reagan was shot, Reagan sent a letter to Soviet Premier Brezhnev saying, "Please, cannot we discuss peace? Cannot we meet in good faith and try to talk and see if we can't ease the terrible tensions of the world?" Brezhnev did not really respond to that letter and was soon enough gone. But then Reagan worked hard on Gorbachev. So he worked he put a lot on the line, Reagan, to make the Soviet Union talk to the United States and to try to get the Soviet Union to change. So it was not only words, it was diplomatic action, military action, economic action.
There were different things that he did. The first thing he did, of course, at that time, the United States, when he took over the presidency, was in dire economic problems. And the first thing he did was to restore the economic vitality of the United States, because he felt unless the United States was strong economically, they could not be strong in these other aspects, either in terms of world leadership, military, and the like. So that was his first step, real challenge. But then he also built up our military. He was concerned that if we did not have a strong military, first of all, we would be not be a reliable ally to our friends or a credible deterrent to the Soviet Union. But also, he knew that if we didn't have a strong military in the West, the Soviets could relax the amount of money that they were expending supporting their own military, which was one of the things, of course, that had led to the deprivation of the Soviet people and the Russian people themselves and people in other countries. So he knew that economic power, and so one of the things he did was to be sure that the West did not do things that enabled the Soviet Union to increase their economy. I remember one big element that we discussed in the National Security Council literally month after month was whether the West should sell pipe layers and other heavy equipment to the Soviets so that they could expand their pipelines to use oil, which was, of course, one of the things that they were using to maintain their economy. And, of course, our position was that we should not sell them these things. We should do everything possible to constrain their economy so that they would not be able to continue as they had, building up their military. That we should build our military. We should use the diplomatic processes and so on. He always wanted to meet with a Soviet leader, and after the first couple of years. His initial decision was not to meet the Soviet leader, Brezhnev, in 1981 or 1982, because he felt he did not want to negotiate from a position of weakness. It wasn't until we had built up our economic situation and had built up our military that he was then prepared, in 1983, thereabouts, and Brezhnev died. And then he was prepared to meet with Andropov, who was the next Soviet ruler, and he died. And then Chernenkov came in, and he died. So one of the members of the press said, Mr. President, when are you going to meet with the Soviet leader? He said, well, I'm ready, but they keep dying on me. It wasn't until 1985 that he got a live one in Gorbachev. And, of course, that was a particularly good situation from our standpoint because Gorbachev, unlike the previous leaders of the Soviet Union, really understood the West. He had studied the West. And so this was a more malleable leader, I think, for Ronald Reagan, and they did have some very great discussions, as you point out, right from the start.
But Gorbachev, he not only had he had a more lively appreciation than his predecessors of the strengths of the West. I think we could agree. But Gorbachev also was different in this. My read on Gorbachev, see if you agree, was that Gorbachev understood that the Soviet Union's economy was unsustainable. He understood that its entire economic edifice was essentially unsustainable in the long term. He understood that the Soviet Union's, the expense of military control of those lands it occupied was unsustainable. Soviet military spending, long term, was unsustainable. Do you agree with that? It seemed to me that Gorbachev, he put up a big front. He never admitted these things. He tried to bluster with Reagan and say, you know we are as strong as you. But I always got the sense of him that actually he understood they were not that strong.
I think he came about to that understanding. I think he did understand their weaknesses, but he did feel that with some changes, the Soviet system could still continue.
That communism could still continue.
That communism could still continue.
Which is the interesting, almost contradictory part of him.
Well, that's right. And so while he understood what you might call their weaknesses, he still thought that they would be able to continue. And that's, of course, why he tried glasnost. He thought that with a little more information, a little more openness, perestroika, some changes, that communism could continue. So that's why he tried these various things. But one of the things, of course, that he did that was different from his predecessors is that as freedom movements began in the latter part of the 1980s and continued on into the 1990s, the one thing that his predecessors, I think all of them, the ones we talked about, Brezhnev, Andropov, and Chernenko, would have done, they would have increased the military rule. They would have clamped down on these countries where freedom movements were beginning.
Yeah.
Gorbachev did not. And, of course, we saw what happened, of course, ultimately freedom prevailed.
Yeah, and the wall fell.
The wall fell. This was one of the interesting things about Ronald Reagan. He was very cordial and open with Gorbachev in their conversations, but he was no less vigorous in his desire to end communism and to end Soviet rule. And that's why he was doing the things that you mentioned. His idea was, in addition to using all the resources against the Soviet Union, it was also to deal with the Soviet Union, as you point out, on a moral plane. In other words, to say that it was immoral what they were doing. It wasn't just bad politics, or it wasn't just bad rule of the countries, but it was actually immoral. And from what we understood later on, it was this recognition of the evil empire, as he once called it in 1983, that gave hope to the countries that were living under communism, the Warsaw Pact countries, that there was a president in the United States who was recognizing the evilness of the Soviet Union and was willing to say it publicly, which no president had ever done before.
Let me tell you, may I interrupt you for a second? The great Soviet dissident Sharansky. You familiar with Sharansky? Anatoly Sharansky. He had been imprisoned for many years in the Soviet Union when Ronald Reagan was president. Sharansky wanted freedom. Sharansky wanted political freedom to come to the Soviet Union. It happens that when Ronald Reagan started to speak in the early 1980s with a particular bluntness and candor about the nature of the Soviet Union, Sharansky in prison would overhear what Reagan had said because the guards in prison would talk about it. They would joke about it. They would repeat what the crazy American president said. Sharansky in his prison cell would hear what had been said. Sharansky would then secretly communicate with the other political prisoners of the Gulag. Sharansky told me this once. He said we would whisper the words to each other. They had ways of communicating through the cells. Sometimes it involved emptying the water from a toilet, putting your head in the toilet, speaking into the toilet. It would come out of the toilet in the next cell. At any rate, they had a number of ways of communicating. But they got the word out in the Gulag of the Soviet Union, the prison system, what this American president was saying. I said to Sharansky, what did that do? What effect did that have on you? How did it make you feel? And he said, it gave us reason to live. It gave us inspiration. We thought someone is telling the truth. That is the beginning of progress. So I always think that story of Sharansky has probably told you that story also, but those things can make such a big difference.
That was why, for example, that as late as 1987, when he was meeting when he was in Europe at the Brandenburg Gate, he gave that talk in which he said, Mr. Gorbachev, if you want freedom, if you want to lessen tensions and so on, tear down this wall. And that was, many people in the United States even thought that was very provocative. You know from your own position in the speechwriting group that the speechwriters, who were always very aggressive and very assertive,
we saw it as very candid and loving truth.
Right. And whereas some of what we call the striped pants people in the State Department and places like that, they were all very worried about that statement. And so I think it was 5 or 6 times people who were advising the president took out that statement out of the speech at Brandenburg Gate, and 6 times or 7 times Ronald Reagan put it back in. Yeah. And as he said afterwards, and somebody asked him about it, he said, well, I had the last word. And so he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down the wall. In other words, it was to maintain, to show that we were not interested in hostilities, but it was to maintain the pressure on the Soviet Union, which ultimately resulted in what happened in 1989 with the wall coming down, and ultimately in 1991 with the implosion of the Soviet Union.
Now let me ask you, I want to get it to the area we are in. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, these nations that were called the Warsaw Pact countries, these nations that were called behind the Iron Curtain, these nations that came under Soviet dominance and control after the end of World War II. How did Ronald Reagan feel about them, approach them? Were these nations, were the Warsaw Pact countries on his mind to a good degree when he was president? How did that work?
Well, they were very much on his mind. As you know, he supported this idea of the Captive Nations commemoration each year in the United States, having Captive Nations Week to remind people of the countries that were under the Soviet domination. When he talked about the evil empire, this is what he was describing. In addition to this, he really, we go back to words being important. Ronald Reagan laid out his blueprint for what the West needed to do in order to succeed when he gave the most important speech of his entire presidency, was the one he gave in July of 1982 to the British Parliament. I was privileged to actually be there at that time. And in that speech, he talked about Hungary, he talked about Czechoslovakia, he talked about Poland and what was going on there, and how this was an abomination, and how the free world had a responsibility to these countries. So he was very much concerned about these countries, and he was very much interested in providing the conditions under which they could have freedom restored.
And I think he thought the key was, once you change the Soviet Union, once you in effect beat back the Soviet Union, once communism falls, the nations of Eastern Europe will be able to have their freedom and will then, perforce, have to evolve into democratic entities of their own and develop democratic institutions and develop democratic ways. I always wonder if Reagan thought to himself, my goodness, the Soviet Union has known extremely limited liberties since 1917. That means for many generations. Eastern Europe has known limited freedoms, limited personal freedoms, political freedoms, freedoms of expression, the right to debate, the right to get together and have a political fight, but it doesn't end in murder. All of the things that democracies have to understand, Eastern Europe had not had since 1945. The Soviets had not had since 1917. What did Ronald Reagan think newly freed peoples in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe would do with their new freedom? Did he not imagine that at first it would be awkward? Did he imagine, well, what did he imagine?
Well, I think he recognized that the importance of freedom was predominant, that without freedom you could not have the kind of a country in which the people had self-determination and the other kinds of aspects, political freedom, economic freedom, and the other kinds of things that go with it. And so I think it was his hope. And one of the things he talked about in that speech that I mentioned in Parliament in 1982 was the aspects of a free society, constitutionalism, the rule of law, the other things that were important. And so I think he had this in mind, that free people would have that opportunity. And indeed, he talked a lot about the various properties, if you will, of a free society. And so I think it was his hope that, and of course there was, in these various countries, there were periods of freedom that they had had before and periods of democratic government. In Hungary here, for a short period, right after World War II, there was a couple of years there in which there were democratic aspects of the country. There had been other things in other countries in which they had had experiences before. But also, he, in talking with the people that had come from those countries, Sharansky and others, he knew that there was a desire for freedom, and that this included political freedom and free institutions. He often talked in his speeches around the world when he traveled about the institutions of a free society, constitutionalism, the rule of law, and those kinds of aspects. And this was his hope and his belief and his vision of how the former captive nations could rise up as free people. And also he recognized the close correlation between political freedom and economic freedom. And freedom, in order to have entrepreneurs to rise economically, was an important aspect of the freedom that people would have politically. So I think it was his hope and his vision that we would have free nations which had formerly been under the yoke of the communists.
And what advice do you think he might have for those nations of Eastern Europe that 20 years after the fall of the wall are struggling to become themselves? What advice do you think Ronald Reagan might have if he were sitting between us today?
Well, I think he would be pleased in many ways by the things that have happened, by the fact that free people have predominated in these countries, and I think he would be understanding that free political societies don't come easily. A lot of writers have said that a free and democratic society, a society in which the people rule, is a messy business. When you have autocratic societies, things may run pretty well because it's all top-down, except that the people can't do the kinds of things that they want economically and politically that gives them the ability to rise above themselves and to improve the situation. And so I think he would understand that that the process of setting up democratic republics is a messy business, a difficult business, but that it depends upon people who understand the importance of freedom and are willing to make the sacrifices, just as our people, our founders in the United States did back in the 1780s. You know, when you read about the history of those days in our country, the people who were involved were extremely altruistic, and they set aside their own personal interests in many cases. They set aside even the interests of the states they represented. This is why they nailed the doors shut so the press couldn't find out what was going on as they deliberated the Constitution, in order to develop a system of government that would serve the people in the long run. And I think that the idea of constitutionalism, the rule of law, those concepts, the idea of separation of powers, one of the things that Ronald Reagan appreciated very much is the importance of limited government, and the opposite, if you will, of communism, where you had all-powerful government, or the Nazism, those kinds of things. And he recognized that this meant that there had to be a certain amount of inefficient activity as one group of people with their ideas rubbed against another group of people. But the main thing was to have a structure in which people could disagree on their ideas and promote their ideas, which might be in conflict with each other, in a peaceful forum, if you will, and that there was a rule of law, so that if the majority ruled, the only way you can really solve problems is majority rule, but the minority had the ability to speak out, to gain adherence, and if they had enough people agreeing with them, to make the changes. So in effect, I think he would be very understanding of what's going on in Hungary today and in the other countries, as people try to determine how best their country can go forward, how they can develop a constitution.
Americans, I'm sure you're concerned about this, Ed, and perhaps this is an issue in Hungary, I don't know. Americans have a way, increasingly the past few decades, of forgetting their own history. They don't teach their own history well. They don't remember their own history well. Sometimes Americans forget that the movement towards American independence from Great Britain had taken steam by 1770 and was a matter of great dispute and conversation among American elites, if you will, from then until 1776. In 1776, we declared our independence from Great Britain. Then we spent the next few years fighting a war with Great Britain. Then we spent the next few years trying to develop a constitution and a form of government and make ourselves, in a codified way, sturdily, a republic. It took us a while to get on our feet, didn't it?
It certainly did. And as I know you're going through discussions in Hungary on things like the Constitutional Court and other things such as that, we still have those debates going on today, some 200 years later, as to exactly what the role of the Supreme Court in our country ought to be, how far they should go, and so on. And of course, on specific issues, we have great debates in our Congress. So, as I say, democratic republics are difficult things because different people have different ideas. But the important thing is they operate in a system of freedom and liberty, where people can express their views, they can gain adherence to their points of view, and they can make changes when a majority of the people feel that's what ought to be done.
All right. Anna, I feel like I would love to. We have just a few more minutes here. If we take 5 more minutes, I was wondering If there were any questions you would like to ask Ed Meese, or any questions you would like to ask me.
I think that the three principles, first of all, is the maintenance of freedom, the importance of not putting obstacles, and it takes many different forms. Yesterday, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled, for example, that the state of California could not prevent the sale of violent video games to children. That was a law that infringed, even though it was a distance from the First Amendment, freedom of speech. But any limitations like that on freedom of speech, or in the concurrent, the freedom of the press, was illegal. So I think the importance of freedom in its broadest aspects. Secondly, I think the idea of limited government. As Madison said, the responsibility of the Constitution of the United States is first, and in free peoples, is first you have to have government to control the people, but then you have to have some means of controlling the government. And so I think the idea of limited government is a second principle. And the third principle, I think, is the whole idea of constitutionalism and the rule of law, that people get treated equally under the law, that you don't have one law for one group of people, rulers or so on, and another law for the other people, and that you don't change this arbitrarily from time to time. So I would say, number one, the importance of freedom, number two, the importance of limited government, and number three, the importance of the rule of law would be the three principles that I would say Ronald Reagan had in mind, and which are very important.
I would say that an issue that Ed refers to that keeps roiling and unsettling America is one that is also to a degree being debated now in Great Britain and perhaps here. It is an argument between those who think that power is most effectively and justly and fairly executed and applied from the bottom up, from the local neighborhood association onward to the town, from the town onward to the county, from the county onward to the state, from the state onward to the federal government, with each area doing what it can do and no more than it can do, and have the federal government what only it can do. For instance, do the national defense. Only the federal government can do that. There are some who see power as best wielded from the bottom up, that it's more effectively wielded if it is locally wielded by local people. There are others who think, no, power should be wielded more from the top down. At the top, we should decide the rules, the desires, the ways of organizing ourselves, and we should tell each layer down all the way through the state, the county, the local, the neighborhood association, how to arrange their lives. That, in a way, is a constant argument in America. It has to do with the Supreme Court decision. A local state entity says it wants to prohibit a form of action. A federal entity says, no, 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 you must not. This is a constant argument in America. It's a constant argument in Britain as the Cameron government tries to devolve more authority and freedom, if you will, to local organizations closer to home. It's that balance, striking the right balance there is something that I think is very crucial for old governments and new ones.
Yeah, I think this idea of the governments that are closest to the people having most of the say in terms of what people do on a day-to-day basis, that this concept is part of the idea of limited government. And so the closer the government is to the people, the more they have an opportunity to exercise their own voice and their own wishes in how that government operates. And so that was the concept of the founders and the concept in our Constitution. And as Peggy mentioned, from time to time there's a great struggle over this as to what belongs where. but it is important that people have this ability then through their elected representatives to decide these issues ultimately.
All right, I am going to declare that this meeting is over and you are all allowed to return to your lives. We thank you very much for coming. I think both Ed and I felt we were very honored to be invited, but we are very honored to have a prestigious and intelligent and full audience. May I also say we are unveiling, we are so excited as those who worked with the old man. We are excited that a statue of Ronald Reagan is being unveiled tomorrow in Budapest. And we invite you all to come, and we urge you all to applaud. We feel he was a very great man who made a very great impact on history. And when you meet a good one, it's always good to give him applause.
Yeah. Also, I'd like to mention that we appreciate the Common Sense Society for having us here, and commend your organization, in which you all see our adherents, for what they're doing here to promote the ideas of, particularly of discussion and of free speech, in terms of the fact that when reasonable people put their heads together and speak out, they can come to some pretty good conclusions, and that's part of this exercise of liberty that Ronald Reagan prized so much. So we thank you for having us here, but also commend the society and hope that they do well here in Hungary.
Thank you. Thank you.